Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's national call. We're going to give it just a few minutes to allow others to join, but thank you so very much for showing up early. Thanks much. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's national call. We'll give it another minute or two to allow others to join, but thank you for showing up. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for showing up for the national call. We're going to give it about another minute or so before we get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending the national call. We're going to give it about 30 seconds or so before we get started. So hang tight. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's national call. My name is Renee Willis. I'm the Senior Vice President for Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and I'll be facilitating today's conversation. On today's call, we'll get updates on President Biden's FY 2023 budget request. We have David Garcia and Ryan Finnegan with the Turner Center for Housing Innovation. We have them with us today, and they're going to share a new report on unlocking housing opportunities for people experiencing homelessness. We also have Courtney Cooperman of NLIHC, who will share the newly relaunched Our Homes, Our Votes nonpartisan voter and candidate engagement project website with you. And we'll also hear from our In Erase Arrears to Stop Evictions, Erase project cohort, and receive updates from the field and more. So today's webinar is being recorded. We'll make the recording available after the broadcast, and you can find the recording on our website, which is www.nlihc.org. And as time permits, we'll take a few questions. So if you have questions for any of our speakers, please use the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to your questions. So let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to start with Sarah Sadian, who's the Senior Vice President of Policy, and Kim Johnson, who's the Senior Policy Analyst at the Coalition. And they're going to talk to us about the FY 2023 budget update. Sarah and Kim, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Renee. So we are coming with big news. Just this morning, President Biden released his FY23 budget request. This request kicks off the FY23 budget process. So I'll share some details about what's in the bill or what's in the proposal, and then some next steps for you and for Congress. So we'll start with the budget request for HUD. And I'll also mention that we'll have a full analysis of the budget request that we'll be sharing out with everybody later on this afternoon. So the budget request from President Biden includes $71.9 billion for HUD programs. We estimate this is about $12.3 billion more than FY21, about $6.2 billion more than last year, FY22. So significant increases in funding. It provides a lot of additional resources to build more and expand the supply of affordable housing, and also to make housing more affordable to people with the greatest needs. So a couple of highlights that we see in the budget request include a proposal to expand housing choice vouchers to an additional 200,000 households. This means that overall funding for vouchers would be about $32 billion. If that was enacted, it would be the most significant expansion of the housing choice vouchers program in its history, and it would help move us towards a path towards universal housing assistance for everybody who's eligible. We're really glad to see that was in the budget request, and it will remain one of our top priorities as this appropriations season continues. Other things that we saw in the president's budget, some things that got really notable increases include resources that would help address homelessness and also to increase the supply of housing. Homeless assistance grants were expanded by $363 million to about $3.58 billion overall. That's an 11% increase from last year. Capital funding to preserve public housing increased by $332 million or 10% compared to last year. Also, we saw major investments, expansion of the Home Investment Partnerships Program. That was proposed to be expanded by 30% or about $450 million to a total of $1.985 billion. So those are the appropriated items on those issues, but we also saw the president call for increasing housing supply through mandatory funding. I think this might be the first time we've seen a call for mandatory funding for housing from this president. I'll have to double check that. So he called for a combination of additional low-income housing tax credits and about $35 billion in mandatory direct spending. Of that $35 billion, 25 would be for affordable housing production grants to state and local finance agencies. About $10 billion would be to get local areas ready for housing development. So that means removing barriers that you might see in the zoning practices, but also getting infrastructure ready, like water, sewer ready, so that that housing construction can take place. I'm going to come back to this request for mandatory funding because I think it sheds some light on where things are with the budget reconciliation bill. So just put a pin in that and we'll come back to that. Other HUD programs received level funding or some increases in funding. For example, project-based rental assistance received about $1 billion more, but that's just enough to keep to renew existing contracts. We saw another $400 million for community development block grants compared to last year, but that's only if you exclude the $1.5 billion that was provided last year for earmarks. We're just looking at program to program levels. And also small funding increases for housing for persons with AIDS, housing counseling, and fair housing. Tribal housing received about level funding from last year. There were, though, I'll say maybe a little surprisingly for me, that there were some programs that did receive cuts in funding in the president's budget. That includes the Choice Neighborhood Program, which was cut by about $100 million compared to last year. The Native Hawaiian programs were cut in about half, from 22 million last year to 10 million. And there were pretty significant cuts to the Section 202 and 811 programs. I think that these cuts may be because the president's budget request was starting to be drafted before we saw the final FY22 numbers. But I'm not entirely sure of that. I have to look into that and ask some folks about what their impression about that is. So now that the president's budget request is out, Congress needs to respond and they'll start drafting their bills. We know that the House and Senate committees will start to put together their drafts and start voting on them. We have heard that House and Senate Appropriations Committee chair and ranking members are really eager to see this process move much more quickly than it did last year. Although we're also hearing that that might not be possible given the very short calendar that Congress has right now before they have to leave for the midterm elections. So I think it seems safe to assume that we might see a continuing resolution starting on October 1st that would push us at least through the end of the year. The question is, does the midterm elections have any impact on what happens with this FY23 spending process? I could see a situation where if Republicans take control of the House and or the Senate, they might want to punt off decisions on the FY23 budget until they officially come in to the new Congress in January. So we might see another CR that pushes into the new year. All that's not very well known right now, but that's certainly something that we're keeping an eye out for. I want to circle back to that housing supply fund that I mentioned earlier and what that might tell us about the budget Build Back Better Act. As you guys know, the Build Back Better Act is largely not happening in Congress right now, but there are still conversations about what a future budget reconciliation bill could look like. If you remember, Democrats are very focused on wanting to pass something through reconciliation because they only need 50 votes in the Senate rather than the typical 60 votes. And so there's still a lot of focus on maybe coming back from after they confirm the Supreme Court nominee to coming back to negotiations over some sort of budget reconciliation deal. We still think that there's a very good opportunity to get housing resources into that package. We want to see the targeted resources that were in Build Back Better, including $25 billion for rental assistance, $65 billion for public housing, and $15 billion for the Housing Trust Fund. Now, when I read about the Housing Supply Fund that's in the president's budget, there was a big question for me about whether or not this was somehow replacing what the president had requested in Build Back Better. Is this a new bargaining chip or a new position that they're starting from with negotiations? But I spoke with folks at HUD who say, no, this is on top of what they want to see for Build Back Better. So rather than sort of arguing against themselves or narrowing their focus on housing, they're taking a more expansive view, and that housing supply fund is really on top of what resources they might be able to get through a budget reconciliation bill or Build Back Better. So there are a couple of places where all of you can be really helpful this year. The first thing I want to encourage you to do is to start contacting your members of Congress and encouraging them to support the highest level of funding possible for HUD programs and USDA programs. You can do that by signing on to our letter. I'm going to ask folks on our team to share a link to our 302B letter. This is the letter that's signed by, I think we're at several thousand organizations so far, calling on Congress to support the highest level of funding possible. If your organization's not on that letter, this is a good time for you to sign on and for you to share it with your networks so we can show that there's really broad support for all of these housing programs. And then secondly, we'd love to encourage you to focus on those targeted housing programs that we feel reach those households with the very greatest needs. So in particular, in addition to pushing for the highest level of funding overall, we also want to see that expansion of housing vouchers to 200,000 households, like was included in the president's budget request. We want to see really significant funding to preserve and operate public housing. We want to see additional funding for homeless assistance grants and competitive tribal housing dollars, and about $100 million to help prevent evictions through legal assistance, among other key things. Outside of the appropriations process, though, there are other ways for you to still be engaged. I mentioned that Congress is still looking at a budget reconciliation bill of some kind. There are still conversations happening. So I want to encourage you not to stop your advocacy there. It's still very important now and over the next several weeks for you to be continuing to weigh in with your senators and representatives and encouraging them to include in any sort of budget reconciliation bill investments in rental assistance, public housing, and the Housing Trust Fund. And with that, like I mentioned, we're going to have a much deeper analysis that will go out later this afternoon, but that gives you an overview of what is happening today on Capitol Hill. And I'll turn it back to you, Renee.
So there's a lot happening, Sarah.
It's a busy day.
Yes, indeed. And we do have two questions that came in. So the first question is, can you explain mandatory funding and how it's different from what we usually see?
That is a great question. So typically everything that we see when we're talking about appropriations bills, that's not mandatory funding. And that really means that every year the funding level for those sorts of investments change depending on how much Congress is willing to fund them. So for example, you can imagine one year President Biden might call for increased climate change provisions and resiliency funds as they do in this bill. Next year, those specific numbers might be changed and Congress responds and they come to some sort of an agreement. Mandatory funding works outside of that process and is just funded based on what the needs are. So for example, some entitlement programs like Medicare, Medicaid are funded through the mandatory spending side, which means that we don't have to engage in this back and forth in Congress to figure out the funding levels. The funding level is just whatever it is to serve households who are qualified for those programs. So when they call for mandatory funding, it really means that they're looking outside of the appropriations process to funding that just would be automatically provided. What's interesting here is that, usually when we're talking about an appropriations bill and the president's budget request, we're usually only talking about appropriated funds, not mandatory funds. But in this case, I think the president wanted to show where his priorities are, what his vision is for addressing housing needs, even if it would be outside the appropriations process.
Thanks, Sarah. And we have another question. Let's see. Hi, Sarah. My locality, Fairfax County, Virginia, will discuss our third quarter review tomorrow at a $2 million plus additional revenue enhancement on the table. How can we best leverage new federal dollars with matching supportive funding for locality resources to better ensure affordable homes for all?
Ooh, that is a very big question. I don't know if I can give you as full of an answer right now, but maybe Jerry can reach us offline to talk about that more. But typically, I'll say just more generally, we think of the different roles of government and who is best suited for what parts of addressing the housing crisis. And very clearly, every level of government has some role to play. When it comes to local governments, they have enormous discretion over zoning and land use restrictions, which we think is really important that local governments can be taking those sorts of steps to increase private sector development. And that in exchange, we really target federal resources to where the private market can't reach. And so in general, we try to recommend to state and local governments that they focus federal dollars on where those resources are needed the most. And that's typically among extremely low-income households.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. And just a reminder, if you have questions for any of our speakers, please use the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to answer your question. And I think that's it, Sarah. I think that those are all the questions that we have for you right now.
Thank you very much. I know it's a lot of information, but we'll be following up with everyone so that you can see it all in one place. Thanks, everybody.
And thank you too, Sarah. So we're going to transition now to our next speakers. So we have David Garcia and Ryan Finnegan with us. They are with the Turner Center for Housing Innovation, and they will share a new report on unlocking housing opportunities for people experiencing homelessness. Welcome, David and Ryan. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Renee. Appreciate the introduction and for the opportunity to be here today to share one of our latest pieces of research. Just a bit of background for those of you who may not be familiar with the Turner Center. We are a housing research and policy center at UC Berkeley, and we focus on all manners of housing, from land use to the cost to build, construct housing, to program evaluations, similar to what we're going to walk through here. We are national in scope, though we are based in California. But today we are very much talking about a California-specific program. The report titled, "Unlocking Housing Opportunities for People Experiencing Homelessness." This is a look at California's Home Key program. If you can go to the next slide, I'll provide some context for this program and why we did this work. And then I'm going to hand it over to Ryan Finnegan, our Senior Research Associate, who will be doing the bulk of the presenting, as he is one of the lead authors on this report. So very quickly, for those who may not be familiar, Project Room Key started in the early parts of the pandemic as an effort to rapidly house vulnerable and unhoused populations. So entering into contracts with owners of hotels and motels to rapidly place these individuals. As the pandemic wore on and funding became available at the federal level, Project Room Key shifted into something called Project Home Key, which was an effort to leverage these sites to create permanent supportive housing or affordable housing. It's now simply referred to as Home Key, and we had the opportunity to examine how this program has gone so far. So you can go to the next slide. We have this one more piece on here. So just a little bit more context. The Home Key program, it gave localities resources and operating support, as well as some legislative regulatory streamlining to both acquire and convert things like hotels and motels to, again, create permanent supportive housing. So we have spent the last several months putting this research together to unpack how the program has evolved and performed to date. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan, who's going to go through the specifics of the research itself. So Ryan, go ahead.
Great, thanks so much. So I'll just share a few of our key takeaway findings. And the findings that we have so far are based on the first initial round of Home Key funding, which included 94 different projects across the state, creating about 6,000 units for people experiencing homelessness or high levels of housing insecurity. And one of the key takeaways was that Home Key managed to create a large number of units with both scale and speed. So you can see on the chart here that what we've got is about 6,000 units created by Home Key specifically, which is more than half of the total number of new permanent supportive housing units created in the 3 prior years together in California. So it's rapidly expanding the pace of housing creation for people experiencing homelessness. And in some regions of the state, Home Key projects are often the only site providing permanent supportive housing or interim shelter opportunities for people experiencing homelessness. Home Key was also, so far, able to provide these units at a relatively low cost compared to other kinds of affordable housing creation in California. So our average Home Key unit cost about $238,000 in the first round of funding so far. Compare that to a typical unit that was an acquisition and rehabilitation unit through LIHTC, the Low Income Housing Tax Credit, that was about $380,000 per unit in California. And so I'll go to the next slide, please. And one of our other key findings was that these Home Key sites were able to catalyze collaboration and action across different organizations and sectors across the different ranges of different hands in the state. So we describe this as being an all hands on deck approach to getting these projects off the ground. And in many cases, this all hands on deck approach spurred new partnerships between service providers, affordable housing developers, and public agencies in ways that we hope adds capacity to the state's local homelessness response system and breaks down silos between people acting in these different domains. Part of the reason that it catalyzed action quickly was that the HomeKey program instituted quick deadlines for expending the capital to purchase hotels and motels and other properties, and for occupying the units. So often there was a 6-month time frame for those kinds of actions. And so one developer told us, quote, "All of us, we've never seen anything go from an application to putting people in housing in just a few months' time. That's just unheard of for a state program." And another person said that a key ingredient to the ability to do that was its regulatory flexibility. She actually called it regulatory magic. So it's this ability to forego some local planning steps, including some elements of the complicated environmental impact review process that allowed people to get these units zoned appropriately and occupied quickly. One other developer that we talked to said our county had been talking about doing a project with this other state program for years, and we were just never going to agree on a place. But HomeKey really pushed us to do something about it. The ability and urgency of this funding allowed us to do a quick turnaround, and that's what helped us be successful. And then lastly, you can see on the slide here, there's one especially eloquent interviewee who told us, HomeKey shows us that we can have big goals and we can move fast. It signals to folks, you're not going to have to live outdoors. HomeKey starts from the premise that we can solve homelessness with urgency, resources, collaboration, and political will. And developers across the state repeatedly told us that this project's innovative way of getting through some of the regulatory difficulties and the support that it provided applicants were real game changers in their experience of trying to provide housing for people experiencing homelessness. And then on the next slide, we'll show one other key takeaway was one area where we think more resources need to be devoted in order for HomeKey to be as successful as it possibly can. And so HomeKey operators across the state consistently told us that converting long-term or covering their long-term operating costs were their biggest concerns. It was the single largest obstacle that they faced. The HomeKey program initially provides about 2 years of an operating subsidy, but that leaves the remaining years of these projects' lifespans up to the developers and operators themselves to cover these costs. And in many cases, the services required for residents are the biggest cost question that's open in their minds. A lot of project operators were relying on project-based housing vouchers to try to cover some of the costs of these ongoing services and maintenance fees and caseworkers and property costs. But not everybody had access to those kinds of resources. So we had one particularly high-resourced housing developer say that we currently have sufficient project-based vouchers to commit to HomeKey projects, but they're just coming from a dwindling pool and we're reaching our cap. There were also other projects where they had simply much more substantial renovation costs than they initially anticipated. One operator noted that the Motel 6 that they were converting was not in bad condition, but it is just something that's cheaply built. So they're having to replace plumbing and wiring that costs more than they expected. And in other places, some of the Motel 6 units and other motels like it were simply too small to provide a comfortable living space to provide a permanent home for folks. So there are a lot of projects where they're combining relatively small hotel rooms into larger units that can house not just individuals comfortably, but also families with children. And so there's one developer who told us, it's just like HGTV, you always go over budget. And so HomeKey provided enough funds for the capital acquisition, but the ongoing operating costs and some of the additional conversions are more expensive than they initially anticipated. And so one of our interviewees told us, I guess the moral of the story to me is, if our society wants these projects to be replicable and sustainable, we need to invest in them. We're taking people who have literally been homeless for decades, and there's a lot of case management that's needed, and that's where the money is needed. So in addition to supporting the acquisition of these different kinds of motels, hotels, and other properties, HomeKey's long-term success depends on its housing being comfortable to live in and providing the health and social supports that people truly need to thrive. And so you can go ahead and advance to the next slide. And those are just the main findings that we have to share with you. There's a ton more in the report. If you're looking for a really long read, then you can check out a report at the link. And we get into a lot more of the details of these different findings. And we also provide some profiles of about 7 different home key projects around the state, including different kinds of innovative models for serving different populations or providing services and housing in ways that show some of the flexibility and applicability of home key to different communities' needs. So thanks so much. I'm happy to address any questions folks might have.
Thanks so much, Ryan. And also thank you too, David. So we do have a few questions that came in. So the first question is, how are these properties managed? Are they one-year leases?
Good question. It depends a lot on the specific project. So the main applicant is usually a public agency like a county health department, housing authority, county government, but they have co-applicants that are nonprofit housing developers and service providers. So it can differ a lot from one project to the next, as well as the way that they arrange for residents. So in some cases, they provide leases with subsidized rent. In other cases, the rents are completely covered. And in other projects, they operate as a temporary shelter without a defined endpoint. So there's a lot of variability from one project to the next, depending on who's running it.
Great, that's great. And we have another question from Tamara, I believe. And the question is, any chance that conviction records and probation and parole will not remain barriers to housing? If not, what legislative action do we need to make housing available to everyone?
So we did, this came up in a handful of our interviews. A lot of them are operating very much so by embracing the housing first model. And so there's no background checks in a lot of the projects that we talk to. So they're quite literally taking anybody that has the need and that they're able to serve. One of the logistical issues that brings up is sometimes the blending of different populations into projects. So for example, in Fresno, they have a string of home key sites together where some of the sites operate as just very much housing first that takes any kind of adult individuals with the need. And then geographically separated, kind of a few blocks away, is a site for families with children. And that's one way that they're trying to negotiate this way of both taking in anybody that with the need and not having background checks screen people out, while also kind of ensuring that they're not mixing groups of folks that could lead to other kinds of complications or problems down the line.
Fantastic. And here's another question, a lot of great questions here. Who would qualify and who would qualify and how would this information be passed along to those intended?
So I'm guessing this is for, in terms of residents. So that also depends on the specific project. In most places, they're trying to use the coordinated entry system. And they're using coordinated entry in much the same way that they would use it for other kinds of permanent supportive housing projects. They're using their vulnerability index kind of assessments, and they're trying to find people with the right kinds of, where they have the right kinds of services to provide to the needs that folks might have. In some cases, though, they do need to go through alternative routes. For example, there's one project that specifically focuses on veterans. And so they went through coordination with Veterans Affairs. And then in other places, they're operating as an interim shelter. And so they have their own outreach and caseworkers that are going out to camps and on streets and, kind of offering folks any kind of extra space that they have through that capacity.
And Abby wants to know, have the residents been happy about the quality of the apartments overall?
Yeah, so unfortunately for this project, we didn't directly interview residents, but we did talk to a lot of developers who told us about the residents' experiences. And in other research on these kinds of projects, residents are pretty happy with these units in general. In most cases, folks going into the units are coming from unsheltered homelessness. So typically it's not like there's maybe a trade-off in the condition of the unit that they're in versus where they might have been before. But in many cases, they're also coming directly from room key. So as room key has been winding down because FEMA funding has expired, then folks are moving over into home key units, and they're often in very equivalent properties. So folks have been pretty pleased with them. And then there are differences across the state, but in terms of locations, a lot of the home key projects are actually located in kind of downtown areas. So there might be some that are more on the outskirts, but a lot of them are also very centrally located. And that was part of the application process, was demonstrating accessibility to grocery stores, pharmacies, other public services. And so that accessibility, I think, has been working out for a lot of residents as well.
That's great. Thank you so much. Great information. And I know you have already put the link to the report in the chat. So please, everyone, take a look at the report. And we're happy that you both are here today to share the information that you've learned from housing people experiencing homelessness. So thank you for all of the information. And I don't know if you have an opportunity to stay on. We do have a few other questions that came in. I don't know if you'll have an opportunity to answer those questions, but it would be great if you could.
One thing I'll just lift up before we move on is that I saw a couple of comments about lessons to be learned outside of California. And one thing I want to point out is in December, we actually had another report that also focused on acquisitions as a strategy to address homelessness. That was national in scope. And so I'll put a link to that report in the chat as well, because I think there are some common threads across states. But also understanding that there are unique circumstances in different states and situations that, are not something we observed in home key. So I'll go ahead and drop that resource in the chat as well.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much for doing that. All right. So we're going to transition to our next speaker, it's Courtney Cooperman. Courtney is with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and she's going to talk to you today about Our Homes, Our Votes campaign. So welcome, Courtney.
Thanks, Renee. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Courtney Cooperman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer at NLIHC. Although it might feel far away, we're actually only 7 months out from Election Day 2022, and now's the time to start thinking about voter and candidate engagement work. Our Homes, Our Votes is NLIHC's nonpartisan campaign to increase voter participation among low-income renters and to educate candidates about housing solutions. Many housing nonprofits might not have been involved with voter and candidate engagement in the past, and it may feel disconnected. They do. But when it comes to securing housing resources and tenant protections for the lowest income renters, elections are a critical piece of the puzzle. It's no coincidence that low-income communities that face the greatest barriers to stable, accessible, and affordable housing also face the greatest barriers to voting. Because of stark disparities in voter turnout between low-income renters and high-income homeowners, too many policymakers turn their attention away from the affordable housing crisis and disregard the housing needs of their low-income constituents. Our Homes, Our Votes aims to break this cycle by providing the tools that housing advocates need to mobilize low-income voters and engage with candidates. The Our Homes, Our Votes website was recently updated to include resources for the 2022 midterm elections. On the website, you'll find all of the tips, tools, and templates you need to get started with your voter and candidate engagement plans, even if you're brand new to this work. The Our Homes, Our Votes toolkit and supplemental resources in the Our Homes, Our Votes resource library walk through every aspect of a voter engagement campaign: voter registration, voter education, and voter mobilization. You'll find a template to make your organization's own voter engagement plan, and for each phase of your campaign, you'll find checklists, best practices, sample materials, and links to resources from external partners. And you can see just a small sampling of all of those resources on the screen right now. The website also includes comprehensive guides to hosting candidate town halls and forums, creating candidate questionnaires, and hosting site visits, all while keeping your activities strictly nonpartisan. And on the next slide, we have some other highlights of the website, including the latest guidance from HUD about permissible voter engagement activities for recipients of federal funding, links to voter registration tips from the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness for people experiencing homelessness themselves and for service providers. We have links to legal resources for 501c3 nonprofits, downloadable Our Homes, Our Votes graphics that you can use for social media, a comprehensive media toolkit, and opportunities to take action on voting rights legislation. And again, the images you see on the slides are just a very, very small sample of everything available on the website. And I want to give a shout out to our amazing NLIHC comms team for all their work to make these resources accessible and aesthetic. You can also find the agendas for our upcoming Our Homes, Our Votes webinar series on the website under the Webinars tab. The webinar series will bring experts with frontline election experience to walk through every step of voter and candidate engagement and support housing advocates' nonpartisan election work. And beginning next week, the Our Homes, Our Votes webinars will take place in this Monday afternoon time slot in a bi-weekly rotation with the HoUSed national calls. We encourage you to join next week's call to learn more about why elections matter for housing advocates, the past victories of the Our Homes, Our Votes campaign, and how you can get involved this year. And we'll also dive deeper into the resources available on the website. You can register on the Zoom link that my colleague Elena will drop in the chat. And finally, just to reiterate, you can visit Our Homes Our Votes to explore all the campaign's resources and reach out to Our Homes at nlihd.org if you have questions about getting involved in the campaign. We hope to see you all on the kickoff webinar next week.
Thank you so very much, Courtney. All great information. And it's hard to believe that it's just, like you said, it's just right around the corner, election day. So thank you again for sharing all of those great resources. And as Courtney mentioned, there is a link in your chat so that you can access the website for the campaign. So thank you so much, Courtney. All right, so we're going to transition now. We're going to switch up the order just a bit on the agenda. And we're going to instead, we're going to go to field updates. And so we'll hear from our partners in the field from Minnesota, from Washington, and from the District of Columbia. And so I'll first turn the mic over to Zach Eichten. And Zach is with the Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless. Welcome, Zach.
Thanks, folks. Yeah, I'm Zach Eichten. I use he and pronouns, and I'm with the Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless. I'm the Public Policy Director here at MCH, and it is great to be here to share a little bit about what we're working on. So for a little bit of context, I'm not sure, what everybody has in each individual state, but here in Minnesota, we have a $9.3 billion surplus in our state budget right now, as well as around $1.2 billion in federal resources from ARP that are still left over that we are trying to divvy up between the entirety of the budget. It actually equates to about 16% of our biennial budget is available in surplus dollars this year, either one time or ongoing. And some additional complication is that we also have, I believe, the only split legislature in the country still. So our Senate is GOP and our House is the Democrats in control of the House. So we have an interesting set of contextual things going on here in Minnesota that we're working with. But what MCH is working on is looking at the experience that folks have from entering homelessness all the way through to exiting into a permanent housing destination, and trying to really nail down what were the barriers that people with lived experience were telling us were barriers so that we could address those with this surplus. The number one thing that we heard was, there's just simply not enough spaces. We just heard a lot about capital here as well. So we're actually advocating for capital here in Minnesota for creating new shelter spaces. We're asking for $100 million for that to create or acquire spaces that could be used as shelter or rehabbing existing shelter spaces. The next thing we're working on is actually funding those spaces, actually having the services that people can use. So there is the federal ESG that is, we have a state version of that. It's called ESP here in Minnesota. And we're advocating for an increase to that program to the tune of $30 million a year. When I first started in this role a couple of years ago, our statewide response to homelessness through ESP was $844,000 a year. Which was pretty bad. We were able to increase it by $6 million a year last year, and we're trying to get it an extra $30 million right now while we have this once in a lifetime surplus opportunity. Next is, as folks are exiting into permanent housing destinations, I'm sure a lot of you work with time limited housing options. We're working specifically on improving a program called transitional housing. And the transitional housing program right now, folks can be in that for 2 years, so 24 months. And we want to increase that to 36 months. We heard from the providers here in Minnesota that that would be a better timeline, especially for some of the more complicated cases, to be able to really set people up in community and get some rental history. So we're working on that. And then we're always advocating for actually creating affordable housing. And the way we do that here in Minnesota is through housing infrastructure bonds, typically. That's a type of bonding that Minnesota utilizes to increase development of affordable housing. So that's really what we're working on. And the way that we like to work here at MCH is really by leaning into our grassroots and like leaning into our providers to actually help people advocate for themselves, and for providers to be able to advocate for what we know they need. I'm a lobbyist, right? And people, especially elected officials, get kind of tired of just hearing from lobbyists all the time. So what we really try to do is empower folks to be able to speak for themselves. One opportunity that we give is through our Day on the Hill. We do a Capitol Day on the Hill here in Minnesota each year. We just did ours a few weeks ago. We had about 500 individuals from around Minnesota, so that's the urban and suburban and rural areas, all signing up to meet with their legislators. We have 201 state legislators, that's 67 in our Senate and 134 in the House. And I think we had 90% coverage across the state trying to get to all those folks. So it was a really great opportunity for people to be able to connect individually or in small groups with their legislators. And that's really the best way that we can work on having that grassroots empowerment to be able to talk about these things. But that's just a really quick field update about what we're working on here on the homelessness side in Minnesota. There's some other really great organizations and groups. We have one called the Youth Services Network. We have Homes for All that are working on other areas of our homelessness and housing response. They're all really great partners as well. And I want to make sure to give them a shout out, because one organization can't handle everything, because there's so much in our housing continuum. So shout out to those organizations as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zach. We do have a question for you. Jerry wants to know, first of all, he says, many thanks, Zach. But he wants to know, he says, you present a common opportunity where some states have post-COVID budget surpluses and need a much more aggressive affordable homes for all strategy while building a YIMBY movement. How do we grow a more aggressive and informed grassroots?
That is an excellent question. So I think that, we run into the issue of NIMBYs and YIMBYs a lot here in Minnesota as well. And I think that the best way that we've been able to do this is really have our providers connect with, the community that they would like to be more present in. And that takes a lot of different forms. But especially like in a Twin Cities area, that was, that's sort of a big deal. We have a lot of like neighborhood groups that are part of, like, for instance, the Homes for All Coalition. So, each neighborhood in Minneapolis and St. Paul typically has some sort of association of folks who want to volunteer in the community. Connecting with them and like really getting into the grassroots side on that is one way to, promote that. And then I do think that, that's certainly not going to fix everything. But that is one way, is really having those like sort of dedicated, intentional conversations, not just showing up at like a city council meeting and like, here's our plan, but like connecting with people beforehand is a really good way to build support for a lot of these things that we're working on.
Thanks, Zach. That's great. And then just in the chat, if you can also just share those additional resources with people, that would be fantastic.
Yes, I will find those links.
Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us today on the national call. So we're going to go ahead.
I'm sorry, I did just see another question pop into the chat here that just really quick. We are definitely connecting with folks who work on domestic violence and sexual assault. We have a lot of really great partners. MCH is a coalition of a lot of folks. We also work within other coalitions that work on those issues as well. So for instance, when I'm talking about ESP and our shelter capital, we just wrap that into that. Like that is front and center of all our stuff: youth, homelessness, DV, and sexual assault places for folks with lived experience to go. All that wraps in, and we're definitely connecting there as well. So thanks.
Perfect. Perfect. Great question. And thank you for answering that question. And thank you for being with us. So we're going to transition now to our next field speaker. So we have with us Britt Ruffin, and Britt is with the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless. Britt, are you on? Yes, the floor is all yours, and thank you so much for joining us. Britt, I'm not sure. We're starting, yeah, there's no audio. And hopefully folks can hear me as well. Yeah, so I'm not sure. I don't think folks can hear you. So let's try this again. There's nothing there. So let's do this, and we'll try to work with you, Britt, behind the scenes to work with the audio. But maybe what we can do in the interim is if we can have, hopefully our next speakers are on from the Legal Aid Society of the District of Columbia. I know we have Beth Mellon, as well as is Mel Zand on as well.
Hi everyone, this is Beth, and I don't think I can start my own video, so if someone could turn on my video, but if you can hear me, it's just going to be me, not Mel. Thank you. So I'm happy to start with the slides, and actually I think the first couple slides Britt was maybe going to do, but I can start off. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Beth Mellon. I'm with the Legal Aid Society of the District of Columbia, and Britt is with the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless. We work closely together on a number of housing issues, and we are here this afternoon to talk about a new bill that is on its way to becoming finalized in the District of Columbia. DC has an interesting legislative process. As folks may know, our laws have to go through congressional review. And usually Congress doesn't mess with things, but occasionally they raise a stink. So right now this bill has been approved by our DC council and our mayor and is entering the congressional review process. So we just wanted to share a little bit about this bill. If you could go to the next slide. And so this is a really overarching bill that advocates have been working on for a number of years. It expands rights around eviction and tenant screening and sealing of records, and then it has a big focus on removing barriers to housing that happen in that screening process, and most particularly really strengthening our existing law preventing discrimination against voucher and other subsidy holders, so source of income discrimination. So we're going to go through these different pieces. If you can go to the next slide. And so I'm going to go through, these are new rights or requirements for eviction cases. I just want to note on these in particular, the pandemic was really an opportunity for us to get some emergency and temporary legislation in place. And I think, then work with our council and kind of say, okay, we've done some of these things. The world has not ended. This is what we should have been doing all along. let's move forward with making these things permanent. And as I go through, I'll note there are a few places where, you know, a particular investigative journalism piece or a particular report played a role. So first of all, in DC, we had a requirement for a pre-filing notice in eviction cases about things other than rent, but not in rent cases. So now landlords will have to serve 30-day notices for rent eviction cases. The law specifies some language that has to be in those notices. And the attempt here was to really have a plain language notice that tenants hopefully will be able to understand, and then we'll advise them of key rights. And so that notice in non-payment cases has to give them the total amount owed. It has to provide a ledger with that notice. And then it has to talk about some basic tenant rights. You have the right to go to court. You cannot be evicted until a court says you can be evicted. And then it has information. The bill number is 24-96. So if you go to the DC Council's website and put in B24-96, you'll be able to pull it up. And then during the pandemic, one thing we did, we have 6 legal service providers who provide eviction defense. We created a common hotline for intake, and that phone number is now going to be in these notices. Landlords will not be able to sue tenants for a non-payment of rent in an amount less than $600. There was a report out of Georgetown's public policy school that found that I think was about 12% of cases in the years prior to the pandemic had been about these low amounts. And so that report really helped create some momentum to get that provision in place. Landlords will not be able to bring an eviction lawsuit unless they can show they have a valid basic business license. And DC has rent controls. They have to be registered or exempt, so they have to show that at the time of filing. Landlords who serve either court papers or those pre-filing notices by posting it on the tenant's door and then mailing it, which is an allowable method of service in DC. If they serve in that manner, they have to provide photographic evidence of the posting. And this was because DC, like a number of jurisdictions, had some real problems with sewer service in these cases. And there was an investigative journalism piece in what's called the DCist. And they really did a great job documenting just out and out lies and fraud by a particular process server. And so the council responded by requiring a photograph of the posting with a date and time stamp to try to deter some of that fraud. And then it requires landlords to serve court papers at least 30 days before the first court hearing. In DC, this had been 7 days. And so we would have tenants showing up at our office all the time. They had less than a week to their court date. They couldn't get off work. They couldn't arrange childcare. They weren't sure what to do. And so this gives tenants a really good window to try to, meet with an attorney, take time off work and so forth to be ready to go to court. And then finally, DC already required these pre-filing eviction notices to be in English and Spanish. And the law now says if a tenant speaks a language other than English or Spanish and the landlord knows that, they have to provide the notice in that language. Next slide, please. And then the law also sets up automatic sealing of eviction case records. So the basic rule is that if a landlord, did not get judgment in the case, so the judgment was entered in favor of the tenant, not the landlord, or case was dismissed or settled without a judgment, 30 days after that case closes, the court seals it. And then for all other cases, it's 3 years. So if there was a judgment against the landlord, but tenants also can ask for those cases to be sealed sooner. And so we have a variety of factors here, and it says what the law says is if a tenant files a motion and says, please seal my case, for example, because the judgment was less than $600, the court shall seal that case. And so, you can look at these factors. Tenant lived in subsidized housing. There was a human rights, in other words, discrimination violation. There was retaliation against the tenant. The landlord failed to repair housing code violations. Cases where there is a potential defense based on domestic violence or dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. And that, really tries to capture VAWA at the federal level, but we also have a DC law that provides protections in those cases. Or if the parties settled and there was a judgment and a settlement agreement, but the landlord wasn't actually able to evict the tenant because they complied with that agreement. And then part of what's been interesting to me trying to work with this is we, of course, want to make sure that if a tenant walks into my office at Legal Aid and wants help, we have a method to work with that tenant to get access to their prior records, because that might be relevant, including to whether or not we can help them or advice we give them. So the law has a provision for that. There's also a provision for researchers. So Georgetown published this amazing report. They were able to do it because they got 4 years of data from the court. And the council wanted to make sure that kind of research was not cut off in the future. So there's a specific provision for that, but with requirements for protections, especially around personally identifiable data that would be in those records. And if you can go to the next slide, if Britt is on and has her audio working, she is going to pick up here. So if we can see if she is available.
Can you guys hear me now? Okay, great. Sorry for that, guys. All right, so I'm going to pick up here. Talk about the tenant screening parts of this legislation. So one big part that we really wanted to make sure to get in was to make sure that we had additional rules and regulations that were in that were going to strengthen tenant rights when they're going through the application period. So before screening an applicant, landlords must inform a tenant in writing or by posting the amount and purpose of any fee being requested, what kind of information they plan to pull. So these are all various things that now, because of this bill, landlords have to put up front so that people can make the decision on their own whether they want to apply or not, and have clear guidelines as to what is expected of them and what's expected of the landlord. So things like how long it's going to take for a decision regarding the application, and information on the applicant's rights have to be included, including that they have a right to dispute inaccurate or prohibited information. They have a right to a response from the landlord. They have a right to the refund of an application if they're not screened. And ultimately, they have a right to file a complaint with OHR, which is our Office of Human Rights in DC, or file a civil action in Superior Court. Go to the next slide. And landlords can't ask questions about or deny an applicant based on sealed eviction records that didn't result in a judgment for the landlord, or eviction cases that are more than 3 years old. And also past allegations of lease violations if they stem from one of the domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or including civil protection orders, whether you're a witness or a victim of a crime, if you're related to a household member disability, or it took place more than 3 years ago. So these are all provisions that are now in this bill. They can't base denial solely on a credit score or a lack of credit score, which is something that clients often get denials based on. And if a landlord denies an application, they have to provide written denial notice with the specific reasons for denial, including a copy of any of the information that was used in the decision, along with the statement of how tenants can dispute inaccurate or prohibited information that was used by the landlord. One thing that we saw in our outreach to people who experienced this was that there was a series of information of things that they experienced, from application fees that were varying. People reported application fees of $100, $150 per adult, and it varied. Some people never heard back from landlords about their applications. And you're talking about people who are extremely low income, who don't have the money to continue to go place to place putting in applications and never hearing back when housing is what they are looking for. And so one major thing in this bill is that application fees are now capped at $50. And so that's across the board. And the legislation also establishes a process for Office of Human Rights enforcement and a penalty scale for landlord violations. And some of the things you see on here, that's one thing that has an asterisk by it because it's subject to budget appropriation. And we are, hoping and advocating to get those funds in the upcoming budget so that those provisions that are around clients filing complaints can be enforced and go into action. Next slide. And one major thing that we were really happy to see in this legislation, we wanted to make sure that there were enhanced voucher discrimination protection. So DC's Human Rights Act is more robust. And so it already includes source of income discrimination, but we found that it was important to make sure that we identified specific behaviors that would be discriminatory practice. And so these additional measures were added. One thing, landlords cannot ask about or deny housing to people using vouchers based on credit issues, late rent, or non-payment of rent that happened when the applicant didn't have a voucher, or income, credit score, or lack of credit score. we know that often vouchers and the denial of vouchers, it goes into a whole realm of discrimination. And often a lot of these issues of credit, income and credit score are really used as proxies to deny people who have vouchers. And there's no reason why somebody with a voucher, the information, about their former non-payment before they received a voucher shouldn't be relevant in their accessing housing now. So these are enhanced voucher discrimination protections that are in this legislation, along with the fact that landlords can't charge voucher holders more rent or fees than they charge people with vouchers, which is something that people, have been experiencing in landlords' efforts to continue to discriminate. And so that's the end of our presentation on this legislation. And we are so, happy that this legislation recently passed on March 1st, and, still waiting for the final approvals and congressional approval. However, we're excited at how much this would expand access to housing for the residents of DC. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. And yes, congratulations. That's such great news that this legislation has passed. We have, it looks like maybe one question that has come in. The question is, how do you address in your bill landlords, property management, and they're requiring 2 times the income despite a voucher?
So under DC's Human Rights Act, source of income discrimination is already illegal in DC, and that would be considered source of income discrimination. And I think that this bill enhances and makes it more clear that income is specific discriminatory practice. And so it's illegal in DC.
Very good. And I think someone just asked, where can they find the legislation?
I believe it was put in the chat. I think right before I logged off, I saw Maya Brennan, who works with one of the council members' office that we work very closely with on this bill. I think she put in a link to the bill, but again, it's Bill 24-96. I can also put in a link to a blog that my organization did, talking about a little bit of background of the bill.
Yeah, that would be great if you could share that. And I did see earlier that someone shared a link to the DCist article on the process servers. So thank you for sharing that as well. I don't see any other questions just yet. We may have a few more to pop on. So if you can stick around with us for a little while, there may be some other questions that come in. But thank you so very much, Britt, and also Beth, for sharing this information with the network.
Our pleasure.
Indeed. All right, so we're gonna switch back. We're gonna go back to, I believe that we have our next speaker on the line, and that would be Andrea Bell, who is one of our project cohort members with Erase. And Erase is the end rental arrears to stop evictions. Andrea, are you with us?
I am, Renee, and appreciation for you and the National Low Income Housing Coalition team for continuing to convene these really important spaces. Andrea Bell, she, her pronouns. I'm the executive director of Oregon Housing and Community Services. And I would just say, I'm so thankful to be here. I'm so grateful to be here in community. I think just hearing from both Britt and Beth I think it elevates and reminds all of us around sustainability and long-term solutions as we're coming from the last couple of years where there's been a lot of hurt and trauma experienced. And while we have some new problems in front of us, we also know that we have some of the same problems to be thinking creatively and sustainably too. So much appreciation to our DC colleagues and that. But I wanted to take just a few minutes to provide an overview of the Oregon Emergency Rental Assistance Program and what is happening in both the rental assistance and the eviction prevention space. So just for a little bit of context and to take half a step back, Oregon Housing and Community Services is the state's housing finance agency. So we work across the continuum from ending and preventing homelessness all the way to stable housing and homeownership financing. So we have been operating the Oregon Emergency Rental Assistance Program since May 19th. And since that time, the program has administered and pushed out over $300 million in emergency rental assistance to tenants and landlords. And just recently, we intended for the portal to close originally a couple of weeks ago, and then we received additional funding, $16 million to be specific, from U.S. Treasury just hours before our portal was going to close, which allowed us to serve an additional 2,000 households to receive eviction protections and rental assistance. Now, you know, for any of you that are contributing towards rental assistance programs in your community, then you know that they are a labor of love, and there is so much sweat equity that goes into this. Last year, Oregon Housing and Community Services distributed nearly $500 million in state and federal rental assistance, which is, for a small state like Oregon, that is certainly a new record for us. As I mentioned, our program launched in May 19th, and we were a little slower to get started in comparison to some of our colleagues across the country. And to date, we've served over 46,000 households. What I want to elevate just for this space is not to go through all of the numbers regarding the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, but more specifically how this program has been an accelerator in launching really both rental assistance that's needed, but then also the eviction prevention system as we think long-term sustainability towards an equitable recovery. Now, as we know, there have been so many folks that we've served that have been experiencing hurt and trauma from just not having their basic needs met. And so a couple of things I want to just elevate is what we are finding is probably what you're finding in your communities, which is that we knew that no one single program was going to be enough to meet the need. And so we needed to be thinking about what's the next step after this as a state agency, as a government agency. How do we facilitate healing and hope after the last couple of years? And so in that collective work, in addition to emergency rental assistance, we have a surge of state investments going into standing up an eviction prevention statewide coordinated system. So this is $51 million, a little over $51 million in rental assistance, what we're considering to be like off-ramp rental assistance, as well as financial assistance, both within these spaces and some of our other spaces with our federal colleagues. I'm sure many of you have been elevated to be aware about the need for different types of cash assistance and financial assistance. And so we want to bring some of those models that have evidence behind them into part of this equitable recovery. So we have that bucket of investments in addition to rent assistance. And then we have about $44 million in housing stability investments, which includes specific investments in culturally specific partners. Again, we know that there's been a housing crisis before the pandemic. We knew that there was long-term injustice before this crisis, but really the question is, what are we going to do about it? How do we solve for that? How do we begin to actually make positive steps in that letter? And so thinking about how we really make sure that we have culturally specific partners, community-based organizations as part of that healing process and being able to respond accordingly. And then we have about $4.5 million in really thinking about the long-term investments. We know that every single dollar counts under these high-pressure timelines. We've had historic levels of emergency rental assistance, but they are one-time in nature. And so our systems have to think broadly and concertedly about what are the next steps. How do we get our system together to be able to facilitate that long-term recovery? We've been fortunate here in Oregon that Oregon legislators and our Governor Kate Brown, have stepped up to make these unprecedented investments. And while I know the word unprecedented has been overused the last couple of years, I think what we're candidly interested in is how do we show up in an unprecedented way to think about long-term solutions, to think about best practices, to think about facilitating truly a healing process for the renters that have been impacted over the last couple of years. In addition to those series of investments, Oregon has also passed important policy protections. You heard our colleagues talk a little bit earlier about some of the policy protections that they have been successful in putting forth. Due to recent legislative action, a renter can temporarily pause an eviction here in Oregon against them for non-payment of rent if they can show that they have applied for rental assistance. So in Oregon, that is Senate Bill 891. And then you heard about some of these bridge or off-ramp rental assistance that we're working on deploying as well. And so just a couple of things I would elevate in that is rent assistance and eviction prevention certainly go hand in hand. So as we sort of monitor rent assistance, we see those resources depleting. There is going to be this larger question that we're all grappling and wrestling with, which is what's next? Once these rental assistance dollars are gone, how do we continue to support communities, and how do we continue to show up for our immigrant, refugee, and communities of color as part of that social safety net that has been incredibly constrained over the last couple of years or so? And so as we think about our eviction prevention system and we think about upstream resources, it's going to beg, again, sort of going back to the things that we know, best practices, continuing to focus on supply of affordable housing, looking at continued investments in permanent supportive housing, and being able to respond accordingly to what people need. We've heard a lot about direct cash assistance. We've heard a lot from community-based and culturally specific entities about their own capacity and needing resources that are not rigid, that are flexible enough to be able to meet this moment. And so I would just embolden us all to continue to think both systematically about the resources that we can pair up and thinking about our eviction prevention systems, much of which were strained before pandemic and are likely going to be even more strained from that. But I think we also know that the rules of engagement have changed. Going back to pre-pandemic state simply is not enough, or in some cases is truly insufficient. And so I think for us, again, as a state government agency, thinking about how to show up constructively, how to go beyond rental assistance, and then thinking about, for us here in the state of Oregon, also thinking about healing and the equitable healing process, and thinking about our resources in that way. And so we are pushing ourselves to learn and improve and evolve, and much appreciation for our Oregon legislators, for our federal partners to convene these really important spaces, and then for all of you just putting in all of the sweat equity into serving your respective communities. So there's a lot that I could say, but I want to be mindful of time and happy to take questions as we have time or as they come up.
Thank you so much. I loved what you said about showing up in unprecedented ways. So great. I don't see any questions just yet, just kind of looking at the chat too. People are really appreciative of the information that you shared. And really just, saying how important it is to include culturally specific organizations in this process, as well as trauma-informed care. So I really do appreciate the work that you're doing around that and really centering that in the work that you're doing as well. Yeah, and so let's see. Yeah, so no questions here, but I really do thank you so very much for joining us. And it looks like one just popped in. So yes, so someone says that this is so awesome. How do you all plan to include the work around trauma and healing? Thank you, LaVon.
Yeah, that's such a really good question. And since we're amongst friends and in collective community, to be really honest with you, we needed to understand how communities were defining healing. I think for us, I mentioned us as our positionality as a state agency, as a government agency, not accidentally. I mentioned that very intentionally because we know that sometimes unintentionally, government agencies have also been contributing to hurt and harm. And so I think for us as a government agency, it was really important, particularly while we're running the emergency rental assistance that requires so much speed, And healing is a little opposite from that. It requires somebody to hit the timeout button and to listen and to learn. And I would say, one, asking the questions, or how are communities defining healing? What does that mean? Not us as a state agency. And then I think really showing up to that honestly. And when I say honestly, with investment of resources, thinking about how we contract, thinking about the really specific level of ways that we engage in contracting, what we think are allowable services. When we say capacity building, digging in to make sure our definition of capacity building is not rigid for our community partners. And then I think the other piece to this, which is a part of why I think we're all here, is healing isn't exclusive to the emergency rental assistance program. It goes beyond that. And so I think the reality that we're all emboldened to wrestle with is, what are we going to do about it long term? The pandemic highlighted things that we already knew, And so now that we know that, now that we've seen that data and we've continued to hear from communities, what are we going to do about it? And so budgets are our moral documents. And so for us, thinking about our budget long term, thinking about how we listen first and act secondly. And then I think making the work that we do, using our positionality to be authentically accessible.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I don't think we have any other questions. I really do appreciate you spending time with us again and sharing that with us. Great information. And so thank you again. So we're going to transition. Actually, that brings us to the end. Yes, it does. And so we will certainly post today's recording on our website, and also look out for an email that we'll share with you that will have all the links and the information that we shared today. But we will post the information on our website. And as was mentioned earlier, we will be changing the format a bit next week. So next week, instead of a HoUSed national call, we'll have an Our Homes, Our Votes call. And please do join that conversation as well. It will be slotted for the same time. So it's Mondays at 2:30 Eastern. And hopefully you'll be able to join us for that. And that will be on April the 4th. And then on April the 11th, we'll come back for the HoUSed national call. But thank you so very much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, and have a wonderful rest of the day.